Hello, Namaste. Welcome to Dave's Hammer Show. This is the flagship weekly talk show of Indigenous television and ITV Nepal. In this talk show, I invite guests, experts, Indigenous rights activists from different countries in order to discuss on the contemporary issues of Indigenous peoples, and I try to connect their successes, struggles, one another. In order to bring the lesson learned, successes, and experiences from different countries, I conduct face-to-face interviews. Sometimes I conduct webinar or video conferences and discuss on various contemporary issues. In this episode, I have a plan to discuss how China can ensure the linguistic human rights of the ethnic minority groups in Nepal. On the occasion of UN's International Decade of Indigenous Languages, how China can promote and preserve the minority languages in China. That UN has recently declared 2022 to 2032 a decade-long international decade of indigenous languages. During this decade, China, being a member of the United Nations, and more importantly, China also has voted in support of UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the year 2007. And China has, to some extent, has recognized to 55 ethnic minorities, which the China calls the national minority groups. And there are dozens of languages which are spoken by these minority groups. And in this episode, I am going to discuss how a Chinese government promotes the linguistic rights during this decade. In order to discuss on this very same topic, I have invited a guest, Gerald Roche. He is a senior researcher and a senior research fellow at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia. And as being an anthropologist, his research is focused on Tibetan language in a part of China, and he already spent more about a decade studying minority languages in China. So in this episode, I'm going to discuss with Gerald how a Chinese government should promote the minority languages during upcoming decades. So Gerald, let me first welcome you to the show, and to start with, could you please introduce yourself and your research, mainly research work in China, focusing on the Tibetan language that you said that you focused your study for last 10 years. Could you just tell me a brief about your research work in China?
Yeah, so my name is Gerald Roche. I'm a senior research fellow at La Trobe University in Australia. I'm an anthropologist, and part of my research focuses on languages in the Tibetan parts of China. So I previously lived in China for 8 years working with Tibetan communities there. I was working partly as a teacher, partly as a facilitator of NGO work, go between local people, local organizations and international organizations. And because of my background in anthropology, a lot of the work that I was involved with there had to do with documenting local traditions, particularly documenting oral traditions. And then gradually that work extended into working with communities to document their languages and work on language revitalization projects. And so that's been my research focus for the last couple of years, last 6 years or so, I would say, has been looking at, first of all, the extent of linguistic diversity amongst Tibetans in China. So the fact that Tibetans in China speak more than just a single language and trying to get a sense of how many of those languages there are, how many people speak those languages, where they're spoken, and what kind of challenges they're facing at the moment. And yes, and then secondly, to look specifically in one case at a particular language in a community on the northeast Tibetan plateau, a language which the speakers call Manikacha. There are about 8,000 Tibetan people who speak this language in 4 villages, and that language is currently undergoing a language shift in the community. So something like a little bit over a quarter of the families who speak that language have stopped transmitting it to their children. They're teaching their children the local variety of Tibetan instead of their own language, Manikacha, which is a quite different language. And so I'm interested in and have been researching the politics of that situation. So what are the policies that come from the Chinese state? How are they implemented at a local level? How are they received by the local population? What has been the broader reaction of the Tibetan community to Chinese policies around language? And then finally, how have international organizations that support language rights been involved with that situation as well? And so a lot of the work has been involved with untangling and unpicking the complicated web of different political actors and their involvement in this situation, and how all of that comes to influence the decisions that people make in their homes about what language to transmit to their children. And so taking those two parts of the research together, so the community focused research with the Manikacha speakers, and then the more broader research looking at languages and linguistic diversity amongst Tibetans. Basically, what I found is that in addition to Tibetan, the research has so far described about 30 additional languages that are spoken by Tibetan people. There's also a Tibetan Sign Language. Those languages are spoken by about 250,000 people, 250,000 Tibetan people inside China out of a population of just over 6 million. So it's about 4% of the Tibetan population speaks one of these minoritized languages. And all of those languages are currently highly threatened. All of them are experiencing this breakdown in intergenerational transmission, which means that in the home, families are switching to other languages, which is either some form of Tibetan or some form of Chinese language, right? In about 2/3 of the cases, they're switching to Chinese. In about 1/3 of the case, they're switching towards Tibetan instead. But what we see in China amongst Tibetans is this complete reduction of one layer of diversity, which was these very small, localized languages spoken by a few thousand people. And that layer of diversity is completely being wiped out, and that's being replaced by these two sort of bigger languages, the national language Mandarin, Putonghua, and the sort of a dominant variety of Tibetan.
Yes, Gerald, I have transited through China many times, and though I'm also close to China, but perhaps there are few literatures available in English about minority languages in China, or about the minority ethnic groups in China. So many people like us are unaware of linguistic diversity in China. You clearly said that there are more than 30 minority languages which are spoken in China along with Tibetan language, apart from the Chinese Mandarin language, which is widely spoken and used in China. Could you tell us a bit that whether or not the languages which are enumerated in census, the Tibetan language that you studied, now the Tibet is a part of China. So could you please briefly tell us the language diversity of China based on your study there?
Yeah, so China's a very linguistically diverse place. it's difficult to say for certain exactly how many languages there are, because you mentioned this idea of counting the languages in the census, and this is not done inside China. So there's no real data on this. There is scholarly disagreement about the number of languages. So you have some sources which list up to 300 languages inside China. That's possibly too high, but possibly not. A lot of the Chinese sources will list about 120, 130 languages inside China. From a policy perspective, the linguistic policy, the language policy adopted at the national level, it only recognizes by name one language, which is the national language. That's the only language that's named in the national level laws. And so then the other languages which can be used and protected and promoted inside China, it sort of has to be left up to the discretion of local governments. So, for example, in the constitution, it says that the languages of the ethnic minority groups, so China has the dominant Han people and the ethnic minority groups, Tibetan is one, Uyghurs and Xinjiang are another, Mongolians and so on. So the constitution says that the ethnic minorities can use and develop their minority languages, but it doesn't say what those languages are, right? So often what that means is that every minority is given the de facto right to use one language. So Tibetans can use Tibetan, but they speak more than one language. So, so that means that even to have the basic rights, which are vaguely defined in the constitution, that the ethnic minority groups have to reduce the linguistic diversity within their own populations already. That's kind of how it works. And so so China officially has 55 ethnic minority groups and one majority group, the Han Chinese. And so if you look at that disparity between the number of ethnic groups, 55 minority groups, how many languages are there? Between 130 and 300, right? And you have this huge disparity, which means that 100 or more languages just have no place in the legal system. They have no protections by the constitution, no mother tongue education, no minority language media, such as the work that you do. These languages just get completely excluded from every aspect of public life in every way. So and on top of that situation of these languages being excluded and left out and so on, the national language in China is promoted extremely aggressively. It's compulsory for all citizens of China to learn Mandarin. There are national targets for the rate of how many people should speak the language and how this should be driven up. There are national targets for how well they should speak it, where they should use it, and so on. So the state governs the national language very closely and very aggressively. When it comes to languages like Tibetan, these minority languages, it's happy to let them exist. It will support them a little bit, but there's always this fundamental imbalance where the Mandarin is promoted much more strongly, and that creates sort of a disincentive for people to use Tibetan. So I always think about it as these three layers of diversity. You have the national language, which is named in law, heavily protected and promoted, aggressively managed, and so on. Minority languages like Tibetan, which receive some support, but very insufficient support. And then most of the languages in China are just completely excluded by law, excluded from all institutions and so on. And it's that exclusion that really drives people's decisions about whether to transmit those languages or not. If you can't get a mother tongue education in that language, if you can't use that language in a way that's economically useful, if you can't hear that language in the media, right, it eventually becomes a decision for people about whether they want to have social and economic success and mobility or retain their language, the state enforces that kind of decision on them, you know? And I think that a lot of people across China in that situation are really, they're reacting rationally to that choice. So something like 50% of the languages in China are recognized as being endangered. So Chinese linguists acknowledge that, right? I would say that level of 50% is probably low because they don't do systematic studies on that issue, because they don't want to count the number of languages. They therefore can't do detailed studies into how many languages are endangered, right? So in this, you know, when I looked at the situation of the Tibetan languages, the situation is it's very severe. Almost all of those languages are endangered and they are rapidly being lost.
China is a member of United Nations and obviously a permanent member of the UN Security Council, and China itself has voted yes to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And China has recognized 55 ethnic minorities, and China terms them, all call them as national minorities. And numerous of minority languages which are spoken by these 55 ethnic minority groups in China. So to what extent the issues of linguistic human rights is talked or dialogued or discussed openly in China? Could you please share your experiences of your research work in China, how the issues of linguistic human rights basically discussed openly?
Yeah, it's very difficult to talk about these issues inside China. When I was living there, I would never have dared to speak about such things. I knew that these kind of conversations were going on around me. So there are Tibetan dissidents, Tibetan bloggers, Tibetan poets who bring up these issues, and they do bring up these issues in terms of rights. The way of talking about these issues in terms of rights is a relatively recent development for Tibetans inside China, and that's primarily because the Chinese government has tried to prevent those conversations from happening. So yes, it's very difficult to talk about language rights issues inside of China, but the issue that I've been looking at more recently is how China talks about these issues inside forums like the United Nations, and specifically thinking about the upcoming decade of indigenous languages and the way that is people. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has very strong statements on indigenous language rights, which include things like the right to revitalize a language. It's quite unique to see that enshrined in a document of rights. So it's probably some of the strongest wording and strongest intellectually documents of rights of indigenous people to their languages. So it might come as a surprise to learn that China actually supported this document very strongly when it was being drafted in the United Nations. But the reason why they supported it is because they claim that it doesn't apply to them at all. So for China, they see indigenous people as something that indigenous people exist in relation to colonialism, and China doesn't view itself as a colonial power. So, for example, in its relationships to Tibet, to Xinjiang, to Inner Mongolia, to the other territories of the ethnic minorities that it has taken control of over the past centuries, it doesn't view those relationships as a colonial relation. I think there's very good reasons for thinking about those relationships as colonial relationships. I think those relationships mirror in very important and clear ways the kind of colonialism that was practiced by the European powers. How China got out of being described as a colonial power in the United Nations is really just through a legal loophole. So when the United Nations was running its decolonization process up until from the late 1940s until the very early 1960s. There were lots of debates about how the decolonization process was going to be organized and who would be eligible to be decolonized. And so after a long debate, it basically came down to a definition that for a relationship to be defined as colonial, it had to be based on the domination of a culturally, linguistically, ethnically foreign population over another population that involved a geographical distance. And that geographical distance sort of became unofficially defined by crossing an ocean. So you have this principle which is called the blue water principle, which is that basically colonialism only exists when a foreign power crosses an ocean and invades another place, right? So China can stand in the United Nations and say that it isn't a colonial power and that it has no indigenous people, because technically, according to this very specific and somewhat shallow definition of colonialism, they're not a colonial power, right? So you have this irony that China has been supportive of indigenous people's rights in the United Nations because they think that it's something that only applies to other countries and that only applies to basically the legacy of Western colonialism. What that also means is that for their own people inside China, they are basically not able to identify as indigenous if they want to. So they can't partake in these international forums about indigenous rights, about indigenous languages, and so on. So we saw this very clearly in 2019 when they had the International Year of Indigenous Languages. And basically nothing happened in China. The Philippine government had an event at their embassy because they have indigenous people and they recognize them. 2 universities hosted some discussions. But in a country with 300 languages, many of which could be defined as indigenous languages, the government supported absolutely no initiatives to support these languages. The government recognizes that these languages are endangered, that they're being lost. They, several years ago, started a nationwide program to document these languages. So their approach is basically to let these languages die, to record them, to put them into a museum, and at the same time to isolate these communities from international civil society and conversations about indigenous language rights, which is really the only thing that's going to support these communities to retain their languages, is for them to secure their rights to language from the state, and the state's not going to let them do that.
Within UN, there is a body called UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, which is advisory body of Economic and Social Council, in short known as CASOC. There are 16 independent experts. 8 are nominated by the states and 8 are nominated by the indigenous peoples themselves. Xian Zhang is one of the 16 independent experts nominated by Chinese government, and I have personally interacted with her, mainly on the issues related with indigenous peoples concerning the Chinese investment. According to her, lately Chinese banks also have developed policy on indigenous peoples in regards to the investment. This shows that the China is open up in regards to the discussion on about the issues and rights of indigenous peoples, and also on linguistic rights as well. As UN now is observing international decades of indigenous languages starting from 2022 to 2032, as I also said at the beginning, language obviously is intangible heritage of a country, and I believe China obviously would like to preserve and protect such heritage or such precious properties, and would like to showcase to the world. In this context, China, being a member to the United Nations, as a researcher closely connected with the issues relating to China, What are your recommendations to Chinese government? How should China or Chinese government promote minority languages during this decade?
I mean, I think we will see in this decade, we will really see if the description that I've given is accurate or not, right? If China participates enthusiastically in the decade, and more importantly, if it allows its citizens to participate in the processes and events and exchanges of this decade, if it does that on a basis that recognizes the actually existing linguistic diversity and doesn't curtail it to these 55 minority groups, right? Then we will, if all of those things happen, then we'll know that my analysis was wrong and that 2019 was not a good indicator of what's to come, right? I will be surprised if that happens. So what do I think should be done? I think the first thing is that there should be pressure put on China to enable its citizens to identify as Indigenous if they want to, right? And that's very difficult because that has to be something more than simply asking people in a public forum, are you Indigenous or not, right? There has to be a long process where the space, the safety, and the security for people to answer that question honestly without fear of reprisals. That space has to be created for people inside of China, right? And I honestly don't know how that will happen. But I think the first step, the Chinese state has to at least clarify its stance towards indigeneity, because it doesn't have a clear stance now, really. The situation that I've described about the Blue Border Principle and the prevention of indigeneity, the denial of their colonial history and so on. This all has to be implied from reading between the lines of what they say in the UN and what they do in practice, right? So I think asking China to clarify their stance on indigeneity and the participation of its citizens in international indigenous forums, that probably has to be the first step. There was this what was the declaration that was made concerning the upcoming decade of the indigenous languages, where they adopted the move nothing for us without us, right? Which is the guiding principle of this decade. And the problem is that we don't know in China who us is, right? And so we can't even begin that process of ensuring participation because China has put such a veil over its population and its status as indigenous people. So this is, you see this clearly in Taiwan. Taiwan has a very robust indigenous peoples movement. It has a specific law to deal with indigenous languages and their protection and revitalization. And this is based on a consultative and participatory process where communities can nominate themselves as being indigenous, they can nominate themselves as being a distinct language, and there's interactions with the state and so on, but it's more of a two-way and consultative and participatory process, right? And that, it would be wrong to say that has granted all indigenous languages inside Taiwan with everything that they need to survive, but at least they're able to take part in the process and take part in international mechanisms and enter into exchanges with other indigenous peoples in a way that people inside China can't, right? And you see this tension in that level of language recognition as well. So the Chinese government, the People's Republic of China, they recognize only a single minority language in Taiwan, right? Because they've enforced this top-down state-centered definition where they've just told people this is one language and granted rights on that basis. But when the Taiwanese government enabled a more participatory process, that diversity becomes apparent and it becomes politically meaningful as well. So I think that indicates what the kind of potential of what might happen inside the People's Republic of China if they recognized indigeneity, if they entered into the spirit of the United Nations mechanisms on indigenous people. And so I think that has to be the first step, asking China to clarify their position on this issue and their intentions in terms of these events.
So Gerald, as we have talked almost half an hour on linguistic rights, mainly focusing on the language rights of ethnic minority groups in China, as we are at the end of the show, at last, I would like to request you to give a short message on how minority languages or how minority language speaking communities in China can promote and preserve or advocate about their rights, linguistic rights during this decade.
Yeah, I guess my message would be in terms of the upcoming decade of indigenous languages and the fate of indigenous languages is that for non-indigenous people, I think it's really important to realize the difficulties that these communities face and the difficulty of the choices that they are making every day, because using their language every day is a choice that they make. Teaching their language to their children every day is a choice that they make, and every day that's a difficult choice because often they're placed in a position of making bad choices, right? To choose between your language and your success, between your identity and your belonging, for example. And so what I hope is that for non-Indigenous people is that they can just appreciate some of the challenges that are being faced every day by speakers of Indigenous languages. And in supporting them to turn their attention to these bad choices and to not add pressure to those communities and to those people who are making these difficult decisions, to let them get on with the work that they need to do. And yeah, I guess that's my message. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for your time as well as your esteemed thought and experiences that you shared in regards to minority languages in China.
Thank you so much for taking time to talk to me. It was really nice to make this connection, and yeah, let's stay in touch. We'll speak again.
Today, I have talked with Gerald Roche, an anthropologist who is also a senior research fellow at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, especially on how a Chinese government should promote or preserve the minority languages during this decade. So next week I will come up with new guests in order to discuss on new issues. If you have any queries in regards to this program, you can reach me at indigenous.television@gmail.com. Till then, have a nice weekend. Bye-bye. Namaste.